Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here in Toronto, and I would like to start just by thanking Lola for her kind invitation and giving me the opportunity to share some ideas with you today. As she explained, I am a working conference interpreter, and I'm remembering now to turn on my remote. Thought I got all my technology on. There it is. Now we'll see if it's working. Here we go. Just to start out, if any of you are on social media or you use LinkedIn, I do a fair amount of tweeting and blog writing and just trying to get information out there about interpreting and what's going on in the world of interpreting, particularly as it regards technology. So if you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, my handle is Professor Olsen, and I can make these slides available at the end of this presentation so you can have access to the contact information. Lola introduced me very quickly, but I want to share with you just a little bit about the projects that I'm working on. I am someone who's very curious, and I work in a number of different areas. First and foremost, I'm a conference interpreter. I've been working as an interpreter since 1993, and I received some training initially when I was young. I actually started interpreting, not professionally, but interpreting when I was 19. And so I had to go through a process of, oh, you're bilingual, you do it. And I think probably a lot of you can relate here in this room. And practicing without having any training. And then starting to get training piecemeal, here and there. A workshop here, a seminar there. And then I was able to go through and finally get my master's degree. And I've spent the last 8 years full-time training interpreters. And I've been able to observe and watch a lot of cohorts go through a structured program. And I want to share with you today some of my observations, and hopefully these observations will help you in your professional practice. I also am the founder of Interpret America. It is an organization trying to raise the profile of professional interpretation in the Americas. And I want to say that what Lola is doing here with this conference is a wonderful effort that is seeking to do exactly the same thing. And so I want to congratulate her on those efforts. And I'm also working in technology. Why? Because technology is having an effect on how we do our jobs. It's also having a huge effect on the way people perceive what we do. And so rather than saying, we're not going to be replaced by technology, I say, well, let's look at technology. Let's see how technology can help us do our job better. But that's not going to be the focus of my talk today. And the fact of the matter is, this is a new presentation for me. These ideas are not new, but this is the first time I've tried to distill them down into a presentation so that at the end of my time today, you'll be able to walk out and say, I can do this, and I can apply the principles that I've heard in my own practice so that I can become more proficient and more professional. Quickly, what I would like to do is just have an idea about the people here in the room. I know you work in the greater Toronto area. I know you are interpreters and translators, but that's about it. So if I may, what I would like to do is ask you just to raise your hands quickly. How many of you have been working as interpreters for 3 years, at least? Raise your hand. 5 years. 10. 15. Okay, so we had 20 years. We've got a few, excellent. So we've got some folks that have got real expertise in this room. How many of you work with Spanish? Okay. Mandarin? French, quite a few as well. I know there are many other languages out there, and I know I've just mentioned the main ones, but how many of you work with languages from Southeast Asia? Excellent. African languages? Okay, very good. Any that I've left out, if you can, just raise your hand and let me know what your language is. Italian, excellent. Russian, очень хорошо.
Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian.
Okay, BCS. Over lunch, I've got a great story to tell you about how BCS came about. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Turkish and Kurdish.
Oh, excellent.
Cantonese is one of Chinese languages.
Okay. Yes.
Romanian, Hungarian.
Albanian.
Excellent.
Polish.
Wonderful. So we've got the, yes. Especially one of my languages. Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Now, a couple of other things. How many of you work as, mainly as professional interpreters? So we've got about half the room. You work settings in the legal system, the courts, healthcare, other community settings, public services, conference settings. Good. We've got a great cross-section here, and I think this is going to be very helpful, and it's going to help me try and tailor what I share with you. And hopefully I'm going to get it right on the money. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to divide my presentation today in 3 parts. And basically it's going to be, first I want to share a story with you. And trust me, the story will relate to interpreting, I promise. Just hang in there with me as we go through it. Because I'm going to talk about cheeseburgers, surgeons, and interpreters. And the reason I'm going to do this is that it's a wonderful opportunity to see how experts relearn or learn to do something new. And as I think about interpreters and the way we do our work, we have a lot in common with other high-stress professions like surgeons or air traffic controllers. And there's a little bit of ego that can go on when we work as interpreters. And so let me go ahead and begin my story. The story I'm sharing with you comes from a book that was published this year called Smart Cuts by an author and journalist. His name is Shane Snow. He's also a graduate of my alma mater, Brigham Young University. But I read this book just recently, and when I found this story, I realized this encapsulates, in large measure, what I want to share with you today. So let me start with a number. Fraction. 1/3. 1/3, and this is in the United States, of course, southern neighbor. 1/3 of all Medicare spending goes to cardiac care in the United States. 1/3 of all hospital traffic is for cardiac care. So we have a lot of cardiac surgeons in the United States. We also have a lot of people that have heart problems. And it's because of things like cheeseburgers. Because we like them and we eat them a lot. And over time, when we eat things like cheeseburgers, our arteries start to get blocked. And it restricts the blood that needs to go to the heart. If you think about the heart just for a moment, it's an amazing machine. It's its own battery, and it recharges itself so that it can last for a lifetime, sometimes up to 100 years, without ever having stopped, ever. Now, I don't think I'm sharing anything really new with you at this point, but the interesting thing is that because we eat so many of these foods that can block those arteries and keep the blood flowing to our heart so that it works the way it should, we end up having to come up with things like this. CABG, that is a coronary artery bypass graft. one of the many surgeries that heart surgeons can do, and one that is extremely complex and very dangerous as well. It has a lot of risks to it. Traditionally, the way this procedure was done was open heart surgery, open up the patient's chest, and then, in order to remove or to place a new artery, graft it onto the heart, and get that little tube running oxygen-rich blood where it needed to go, they would have to stop the heart. And as you can imagine, stopping someone's heart is a pretty risky business. Hearts don't have on-off switches for a reason. And so when people had to undergo this surgery, very often patients would then have fairly serious side effects. And it would have a huge effect on their quality of life. Well, surgeons discovered a new technique. And that new technique was to replace those arteries while the heart is still beating. Now, if you think about that, when you've got thousands of surgeons that already know how to do the old procedure, and a new procedure comes along that is better, but also new and complex, you've got a lot of experts that have to relearn how to do what they've done in the past. Now, if you think about that for a minute, and I asked here, we've got a pretty good cross-section. We've got some folks here that have been working for over 20 years. And if there's one thing that I've noticed as I've worked with interpreters, we tend to be very proud of our work and our languages and our accomplishments. And so when we have to start listening to criticism, or someone might mention something to us, or things don't go the way we would like them to, we have some interesting response and defense mechanisms that we often use. Well, guess what? It was the same way with the surgeons. So what did they have to do? Well, I'm going to get over here and check my notes and see if the technology's cooperating with me. And for some reason, it's doing strange things. So my notes may not be exactly where I would like them, but I'm going to do the, oh, there we go. Very good. So, if I can get there. There we go. Something strange is going on. Bear with me, technical difficulties. As we worked through this morning, it's been interesting. So if we can get things running like they should. And then I'm going to from that current slide. There we go. Now I've got everything working the way it should. So when this all started to come about, a researcher by the name of Gregory Stats, who was at Harvard University, he was studying failure and how people deal with failure. He found out about this and said, wow, I'm going to see a lot of experts fail because they're going to have to learn this new surgery, because the simple fact of the matter is they weren't going to get it right every time from the very beginning. It's a simple fact. They have to learn just like everyone else. And so Professor Stats actually observed with his team 6,516 CABG operations. They watched the doctors. They watched the doctors who were observing the surgeons as they performed the surgery. And they watched to see what would happen. They also tracked the success rates of each individual surgeon in this study. They watched the surgeons that failed, and they tracked their progress. They watched the surgeons that were successful, and they tracked their progress as well. This research took many, many years, and when it was finally published, Professor Stats was now at UNC Chapel Hill, where he continues to teach today. But he found out some amazing things. And And this is where I want us to start thinking about our own practice as professionals. Oh, it's going by and it's not mixing here. Sorry, I'm trying to run two screens here. And there we go. Let's switch to that. I'm not sure what's happening. Let's see if this. So what did they find out? Well, the surgeons who botched the new procedure, they ended up doing worse afterwards. So if you did poorly on a procedure, statistically, you were going to do poorly the next time. The surgeons who did well or had a successful procedure, well, they were going to be more successful in the future. Now, it's interesting if you think about it, the way everyone talks about failure today. Oh, we need to go out and fail so we can succeed. Right? It's really popular to talk about that. And yet, the research showed that surgeons who failed tended to fail more, and those that were successful tended to be more successful. Now, that's the first two observations. The next was that surgeons who watched other surgeons fail tended to improve. Think about that for a moment. What does that mean? Also, the surgeons who saw others fail saw their own success rates increase with every failure that they saw of another colleague. Now, interestingly enough, stats concluded that doctors have developed a coping mechanism. And that coping mechanism has led to what he coined, together with his team of researchers, as the paradox of failure. People explain their successes in terms of internal factors. Because I'm skilled, because I'm good at what I do, because I speak these languages very well. But if I fail, what am I more likely to do? The lawyer was just simply speaking too fast. The sound was really, really bad in the room. Oh, well, the patient was speaking a dialect from the part of a country where, frankly, they just don't speak very well. When we make mistakes, we say it's because of external factors. It helps us feel good. It helps us know that I'm still a good interpreter, even though I didn't do so well today. And we've all had our ups and downs. I know I have. So how do we begin to apply this whole idea of the paradox of failure? This is what, sorry, I got his name right, I think he said Jeffries, Bradley stats. He said, even though an individual failure experience may contain valuable knowledge, without subsequent effort to reflect upon that experience, and the potential learning will remain untapped. So think about this for a moment. When was the last time, after an interpreting job, that you actually took 5 or 10 minutes to evaluate your own performance? Say, how have you done? What could I have done better? Where could I have improved? The interesting thing about the studies, this study and the conclusions they found is that those doctors that observed other people fail didn't improve because they saw other people fail, necessarily, because the other person failed. They were able to look at other people. Now, interestingly enough, we look at other people and we say, oh, she was successful because that was a really, really easy speaker. But if I were doing it, oh, it's because I'm very talented. And so you have the inverse when it's other people. They do well because they got lucky. They do well because the external factors were all in a line for them. All right, but if they fail, oh, it's because they're not very good at what they do. Do you see the paradox? But what the surgeons did that observed others fail is notice where they made their mistakes. So that when they got into the same situation, they weren't going to make them like their colleague had done. Now, for us to even be more successful as interpreters, what we need to do is not only observe and learn when we see other people struggle, but be able to recognize our own weak points so that we can address them and improve upon them. That's where the potential learning is often left by the wayside because we aren't focusing on ourselves and our own practice. So let me move on here. Again, I apologize for the problems with the technology, but it's just part of what can often happen. Now, I want to share 6 rules with you about how you can improve your practice in interpreting. When Lola and I went back and forth, and I have to admit that she is probably one of the most patient people in the world. This has been a very busy year for me. But when we started talking, I was very enthusiastic about being here, and still am today. And we were talking about ideas. Oh, I think we could look at this. I normally talk a lot about technology and how that's changing professional practice and the opportunities. But we went back and forth and said, well, I'd like to see if we could do something to help people work on simultaneous interpretation. I thought, great, I teach that. I love teaching people how to interpret simultaneously. Then we looked at the room and we thought, this might be a little difficult if we're going to try and get people doing exercises and trying to teach some kind of way to approach simultaneous interpreting or to improve. And so kind of moved along, and this is where we are. So these are rules that you need to apply in your own practice so that you can see forward movement, so that you can see improvement. So let's take a look at some of these, and I'm going to ask you some questions here. First one is, do you agree with this statement? You are what you do. Not necessarily. Nice hedged answer there. Not necessarily. Give me more context. That's what I always teach my students when we first start interpreting. When they have someone come up to them, we all know what it's like. Oh, you're a translator. How do you say this? Rather than bobbling, I always say, oh, well, I have to have the correct context. Can you give me more information? And in my mind, I'm just going as fast as I can. What is that? Let me see if I can remember. So, good answer. But let's get to a little bit more existential question here. Are we what we do? Am I an interpreter? And does that define me? No, it does not. However, subconsciously, I think we do often let ourselves be defined by what we do as a profession. But I would submit to you that that is not the case. And I would submit to you that if you do have a perception, and you need to look inside and ask yourself, do I really define myself by what I do? Is my personal worth defined by what I do? I know I've struggled with it, especially when I have bad days and things don't go the way I'd like them to. But we have to learn to decouple. And this is rule number 1. Separate who you are from what you do. Why? Because otherwise you're never going to be able to have that ability to have an empirical experiment, if you will, of different approaches to your work. You have to be able to step back, like the surgeons who watched other surgeons fail. They could watch them and say, oh, that's not my patient. I can go home with a clean conscience tonight. I'm not the one that was operating on him when he passed away. But he really screwed up on that. He shouldn't have done that. I'm going to remember. I'm not going to do that. We need to be able to do that with our own practice. And ask ourselves, okay, why did that go bad today? Why did that not go badly? Why did that not go the way I wanted? wanted when I was in the room. If the sound was bad and I really couldn't hear, all right. Next time, I have to make sure that I'm going to be in a place where I can hear the speaker well. Otherwise, compromised sound is not going to allow me to work. We're going to see those things for what they are, and we'll look at them objectively. Separate who you are from what you do so that you can look at your own practice in an objective fashion. Ow. This shows me what I see interpreters do all the time. They don't learn from their mistakes. Don't fall into the same hole twice. I watch time and time again as people go in and they don't have an approach to their practice that will allow them to recognize, okay, this is a problem, this construction when I see it. For example, in simultaneous interpretation, whenever I see particularly in my Romance languages and also in English, if I have a sentence that begins with a prepositional phrase, that's a problem. Because it could end up very poorly if I just go right after that prepositional phrase using the same syntax. It might work out, but more often than not it won't, and it will lead to bad syntax in the target language. But I watch students, I watch professional interpreters time and time again run into that hole, fall into it, get out and say, oh, that didn't work. And then they'll fall into the hole again and again and again. Because they don't analyze why they're falling in. And they don't find a way to get around it. I mean, how many times do you have to fall into that same hole before you say, I'm either going to walk around it or I'm going to cover it up? We have to find those ways so that we can avoid committing the same mistakes over and over. How many of you have run into a certain concept or a certain term when you're interpreting and you just kind of muddle through and you say, oh, that was horrible? It's like, I'm going to go get a coffee. Right? And then it comes up again and you go, oh, that was horrible. When's the next break? We have to take advantage of these mistakes so that we can learn from them and that we can get better. Okay, this is a really interesting one. The internet and social media, particularly Web 2.0, and the advent of Facebook and YouTube and many other social networking sites that allow us to express our joy or our disgust with the click of a button where all we're going to have is thumbs up or thumbs down. Or in this case, happy, indifferent, sad. Leads us to simplify our feedback far too much. In fact, we see it happen all the time. If someone were to ask you, how did things go today with this job? They went well. Oh, they went poorly. And it doesn't go much beyond that. You've got to be specific with your colleagues and also with the feedback that you give yourself. It has to be actionable and it has to be measurable. Let me just give you a few examples. And you don't need to raise your hands on this one, but just think about this for a moment. How many of you that work as interpreters have ever taken the time to record yourselves and then go back and listen to your recording with a critical ear? It's a scary thing. I know a lot of people, we've got some people that actually raise their hand. That's good. It's great that you're doing it. because it's what I try to ingrain into my students to get used to listening to their own voice. How many of you, if I were to say, oh, if you listen to a recording of yourself, the first thing you think is, oh, I hate the way my voice sounds. That's the first barrier. You've got to get past that one. Our voices are what we use to do our job, and it's the voice we are blessed with or cursed with, however you want to look at it. And you have to make peace with it. And after that, then you start listening. Let me give you an example of some very simple, measurable, actionable feedback. Have someone who's a native speaker of the language, especially if you're working into your B, or an acquired language, and have someone listen to it, maybe just 5 minutes of a recording, or 10 minutes. And have them count how many times you use a filler. And you say something like, insert whatever noise is made in your language. But they're out there. And count how many times it shows up. Then ask yourself, why is it showing up? Is it because perhaps you weren't sure what to say and you were afraid of silence? And so rather than stopping and thinking for a moment, you do a long, I mean, one of the noises that I get in introductory simultaneous classes fairly early on is, they don't even realize they're making the noise. Because they're not sure what they're saying and they're focusing on so many other things. Ask yourself why those noises are happening. And then try to get at the source. The other one that I love, and I've seen myself do it as well, where rather than stopping and letting people know that perhaps I'm unsure about something, or just being quiet, you suddenly have to clear your throat. When in reality, you're thinking as fast as you can in your head, how am I going to get around this? Because I don't remember. Okay? Count how many times that shows up, and then ask yourself, why is it there, and what can I do to stop it? One of the things I teach my students is to not be afraid of silence. You control it. It's your rendition. There's a big difference between interpreting like this and then continuing, or interpreting like this and then continuing. Big difference. There are many other specific actionable things that you can find. You can be looking for correct terminology. You can be looking at voice quality. There are so many things that go into a good package when you interpret. But it has to be measurable, specific, actionable information. Okay. This is another really interesting one. Form and function. And the teeter-totter can go in different directions depending on what area we're focusing on. But here, I'm talking about what you do to improve your practice as an interpreter. Remember, function is more important than form. What do I mean when I say this? I have people ask me all the time, how do you keep your terminology? How do you keep track of this? How do you work on expanding your vocabulary in your working languages? My short answer is however I can. I have students come, well, do you use this software? Or do you use that software? Do you use this program, or do you find it working better to do this or that? And I will tell them, you need to find what works for you in your circumstance. One of the things I use, and I forgot to get my little prop, it's in my backpack, is just a little black notebook that I can fit in my suit pocket, so that when I hear something, I can write it down quickly. and then go back and look it up and do the research. Then I'll probably put it into a spreadsheet. The tool that I often use most in the booth is a long Excel spreadsheet with columns for my working languages and examples. It is not alphabetized, it's actually in chronological order based on the jobs that I do. And then I just use a search function when a term comes up and I can find it quickly. Is it the best way? Is it the most organized? No. But the key is, it works for me. Function is more important than form. If you're not doing something to systematically work on improving, then you're leaving improvement in your interpreting practice entirely to chance. And yes, you will learn things over time, and slowly things will accumulate, and you may learn how to deal with difficult constructions, or you may not. I've met a lot of autodidacts that have learned how to interpret on their own that continue to commit the same mistakes that they did when they started 20 years ago. You've got to focus, and you do have to have focus on function and give it the form that works for you. How many of you have ever felt like that? All of us have a weak link somewhere in our chain, and we all have our limits. All of us do. Next rule. Know your limits and your level and reach just beyond them. Making huge leaps and bounds in your interpreting performance doesn't happen that much. And usually I've found that the leaps and bounds then often, the more pronounced the peaks, the deeper the valleys. It's what often happens. So you want to be working so that little by little you can improve. And then when you look back a few years down the line, you'll see that there's been significant improvement. But you have to reach just beyond what you think you're capable of. This has a lot to do with, the kinds of jobs we accept, the kinds of positions where we think we can do a good job, what makes us comfortable, what makes us a little uncomfortable. And all of us have to find that sweet spot to know what it is that we should be doing and how we're going to decide if a job is right for us or not. But remember, if there is no growth and no movement, what you end up with is just being stuck. So, here's the last one. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this photo. I actually took this photo. This is not far from where I live, on the California coast, looking out on the Pacific Ocean. And it's an interesting place because we have a lot of tourists that come through the area. And from time to time, I will go out for a walk on the coast, and I will see places where we've got beaches with all of these kinds of rocks. And I didn't build this, I found it. It was after a weekend. A lot of people are looking to find peace and balance and meaning, and they tend to gravitate to really beautiful places. And people will build these towers of rocks all over. Represents a lot of balance. Number 6, and this is the last one, but I think it's probably the most important. Because if you can get this down, all of the other rules will be fairly simple. Are you a reflective practitioner? And by that, I mean, do you look at what you're doing as an interpreter and really ask yourself, am I giving the best I can? Or did I just muddle through? Now, giving the best you can doesn't mean working just for work's sake. It doesn't mean I've got a 2-hour job and so I'm going to prepare for it for 3 days. Because we have to work smart and we have to make sure that we budget our time adequately. But we need to be mindful about the way we work and ask ourselves, is there something I can improve upon? This mindfulness, also understanding the state that you're in when you interpret. Knowing, I'm going into this job, I'm a little nervous, and so I need to be aware of that. That nervousness, how can I use that? Can I channel it to help me focus better? Did I eat well? Did I sleep well before I go into my job? All of these things will have an effect on how we perform. But if we don't think about them, we may go in and have things just go terribly bad. And we'll think, I'm not any good at this. And what happens? We don't separate ourselves from what we do, and suddenly we feel like, oh, I'm a failure. I can't do this. I don't want to. I've watched students that have walked away that could have really been successful in the language professions. But because they weren't able to separate what they do from who they are and really reflect, they didn't make it through. And they didn't reach the potential that was truly there for them. Remember, and I'll share this quickly with you just to illustrate what I mean when I'm talking about mindfulness. I used to practice when I was a student a lot. 4, 5 hours a day. And I can remember on one occasion, it was during the summer months, I didn't even have class. I was practicing simultaneous interpretation using political interviews from Mexico. And I had to get my practice in. And so I got home from actually some summer classes I was taking in central Mexico, and I was so determined to get all of that practice in. It was a really hot day. I had a drink. I decided to skip lunch and go practice. The speech was a disaster. I couldn't get 3 words out that would make sense. I couldn't focus. I noticed how I was struggling with attention split. I would hear the speaker, but I couldn't speak. I would focus on what I was trying to say, and my hearing would just go away. I wouldn't hear what the speaker had to say. My attention was just all over the map. And I was frustrated, and I wanted to just throw down the headphones and just, no, I don't think I can do this. And after that, I went and just said, I'm not going to do this anymore today. And I went, finally got something to eat, don't know what else I did. The next day, I got home, I ate well, I took a nap, got up, interpreted the same speech, and it came out beautifully. The light bulb turned on for me at that point, and I had learned a very important lesson. One, that I need to make sure that I take care of myself, and that working for the sake of work and practicing for the sake of practice wasn't going to get me to my goal. And I realized that I could interpret that speech and do it well. So I learned very important lessons just by paying attention to my own physical condition and the surroundings I was in. Think about how that can apply to what you were doing. Okay? And Lola, I must admit, my timer isn't working or anything, so I'm not sure how I'm doing time-wise. I hope someone can give me time. I'm going into my 3rd section now, where it's going to be your turn. We're going to try to do a little bit of feedback.
We have 50 minutes still.
15?
50.
50?
Yeah,
Oh, wow, this is going much faster than I thought. Normally I have the exact opposite problem. So, all right. Make sure you're listening when people give you feedback. Feedback comes not in the way that we would normally think. My students think that feedback is my professor is going to sit down with me and work with me. Sometimes I get to do that, but when I have over 30 students, it's really hard to give them individualized feedback for a half an hour every week. When you are working professionally, it's very difficult to get feedback from people because they're doing their jobs. But they will give you feedback in the way that they respond, in the way that they sit. For example, if you are interpreting in a situation, let's say healthcare, and you're in one of the triadic forms where you've positioned yourself, and you notice that the caregiver is doing this, you probably aren't speaking quite loudly enough. And so you need to adjust, or maybe you need to move. Look at that and ask, what do I need to do? And make your adjustment. Also, if people respond and they don't necessarily respond in the way that you expected, ask yourself, not, they didn't understand me. Think, well, did I really make myself clear? Did I interpret that idea correctly? Okay? So you will get feedback in many different ways. If you have the opportunity, in some cases, where you may be able to ask for feedback. Say if there's anything that would help improve, you don't want to actually say, so how did I do? But if you have the chance to ask, what could I do to make this encounter work better next time? Remember, specific action works really well. When you have that kind of a situation, they may have one or two things and they can help it, give it to you immediately. This is a screenshot of a practice log that I use with my students. It's very simple, but what it does is it systematizes the way that they approach their practice. And when I say practice, we've got a polysemic word there where practice is one, it's your professional practice, it's what you're doing, and then you have practice where you're actually practicing to get better. You could do this for either, to the extent that you're able to keep track and keep this personal. It includes simply the date, time, place, the topic that was, or the speech that was worked on, and then whomever they were working with. I have my students work in groups of 3, and it works best that way for them to get the most out of their practice sessions. I then include a spot just for them to write down observations and notes about how they did, where they struggled, what went well, helping them get to that area of mindfulness to say, this is where I struggled and these are my problems, is really difficult. I'll tell you, because in academia, we get trained to think in terms of, here's the assignment, do the assignment, turn in the assignment, get a grade, feel good about your grade. Move on to the next assignment. This isn't the way this works. You're the one that is keeping this for yourself. And as you are able to systematize this, you can then go back to it. And you can find out, particularly it works well to find out when you're falling into the same hole over and over again. Over time, it allows you to recognize patterns in how you do your work. Again, if you're doing your recordings, another thing that you'll find out very quickly is if you have any specific crutches that you use all the time. My crutch in English is so, 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 so. And when I listen to a recording and I hear myself say it close to 20 times in a 5-minute segment, I know I got a problem. I got to work on it. Because it doesn't sound natural. But these logs and systematizing this, that is how you will be able to keep track and how you'll be able to monitor your own progress. All right, this is going to be an interesting experiment. The audio is okay, but I want you to think. Now, you're being asked to provide some feedback. We're going to listen to a quick segment of simultaneous interpretation. This is a video that was prepared for the Olsen program in Europe. The person you see on the screen, although not very well, it's a little blurry. His name is Matthew Parrott. He's a professional simultaneous interpreter. Excellent. He's also a stand-up comedian. It's a great combination. And he's going to give a couple of examples of interpreter performance. Okay? It's just a few seconds long. I would like you to all listen, and we can even listen to it once or twice, if the technology behaves. And I want you to think about those 6 rules that I've given you. And Matthew gets out of the booth and says, so how did I do? What can I do to improve? What do you do? Okay? So let's take a listen. Switch here. There it is. There's my clock. I see I've been going for 54 minutes. Okay, so if everything works, you should hear Matthew. Might be a little, let's see. Switch to this one.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to talk to you today about Romania, and 24% of the Romanians, of the pigs in Romania that have been invested in the last 20 years or so, the pig farms, are much larger.
Okay. What are you telling?
Was talking too fast. He made the pauses without no reason, and he was doing some using saw or something like that.
Are you going to have this set for posterity?
So should I repeat it again?
Yes, please.
So according to my opinion, he was talking too fast. I wasn't able to understand him really clearly. Then he made some pauses without no good reason, using saws in the middle of 2 words, which he shouldn't. And that is my observation.
Excellent, thank you. She needs a round of applause for those observations. Anyone else? You simply agree. Now's your time. Anybody have any? Come over here.
You just need to pace yourself well in order to provide a stable and easy to listen to interpretation.
Okay, so pacing was a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
It sounded like he was anticipating incorrectly what was being said, and as a result he had to correct himself, which was more confusing.
Okay, so problems with anticipation, incorrect anticipation. Okay? Anybody have anything else they'd like to add? There's plenty that you can talk about here.
I'd say I felt like he was just grabbing onto words, whatever he heard, instead of taking a step back and waiting for the actual message. He just heard a word, said it, instead of waiting for a few seconds and get the idea, because we interpret ideas, not words.
I like that. Ideas, not words. You can come teach with me. Okay, so I'm sure we could pull out a lot of other things as well, but we had the pace was problematic. I think that fits with the speed where he was just speaking far too quickly. Pauses in odd places, anticipation problems, and chasing after words. Okay? Those are all excellent points of feedback. Now here's the interesting thing. Masters who attain a very high level of proficiency in any kind of endeavor, whether it be surgery, interpretation, music. The study that I mentioned previously showed very clearly that masters much prefer negative feedback to positive. Why do you think that is? I'm going to go all the way here to the back.
Because being a master, I guess they want to learn from their mistake. They want to grow.
That's a great answer.
Actually, I think that you can make a better progress if you hear about your mistakes, rather if someone is patting you and telling you, oh, you are great, you are not getting out of it anything. But if someone gives you a good criticism, then you can learn from that criticism and improve yourself.
Excellent. I think those two answers go hand in hand. Masters prefer receiving negative feedback because it allows them to focus on the areas where they need to improve. In theory, that sounds wonderful, doesn't it? I think we've got one more comment.
Perhaps also failures, mistakes keep you motivated, trying to improve yourself.
Yeah, constant improvement. And I would say, we've got another comment over here.
I think that masters are more they know that they know stuff, so they are not horrified by negative feedback, so they take it easier and it allows them to use it actually.
So they're able to use that negative feedback more successfully. One more comment.
Unlike Ruski or the new interpreters where they need more positive feedback in order to let them maintain their progress, masters, they know their field and they just have a couple of or maybe just several areas for improvement, and so they can be more dedicated or focused on those areas. So they're not afraid of being pointed out, mistakes or areas for improvement.
So again, masters have separated who they are from what they do. I agree with all of these comments, and I would say I agree with them in theory. And I think that it's the way that we should be. But I know that the human in us still gets in the way. Because I know sometimes it can be very difficult for me to take correction from certain colleagues. Just being really honest. Because sometimes I just want to bristle and think, oh, who are you to tell me that I should, because you, and I remember. But we have to keep that under control. Because if we really want to learn and we want to improve, we have to take the master approach. And by doing so, but I totally agree with the comment that when you find people that are true masters, they are the ones that are able to take that negative feedback and turn it into positive improvement. When someone's coming into the profession, and I see this very much, particularly with newer interpreters, that separating those two things can be extremely difficult. And sometimes it even is for me. Even after 16 plus years or almost 20 years of interpreting. So we go back and we talk to Matthew and we say, well, you need to slow down, pause in the right places. I don't know what the other ones were here. Memory techniques are failing me. Yeah, don't chase after the words. Get an idea before you actually start speaking. So you don't get, in Romania, pigs in Romania, and there were a lot of false starts. There was a lot of backtracking. Okay, so what we've done is we have been able to note all of the symptoms. And now you ask yourself, but how do I not do that? How do I keep that from happening? Which we can get into a whole discussion, and I'm not looking to parse this performance that we've just watched on the video. But we have a lot more that we need to do. And it's not just pointing out what the problems are. And this is where you, as an interpreter, if someone shares that feedback with you and says, you were just speaking so fast, I couldn't make sense of what you were saying. I, as an interpreter, am going to take that, and I'm going to go back and listen to my performance, see how I perform. And I'm going to adjust. And I'm going to continue to work on that. and focus on those specifics. Okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at Matthew's second time around.
May I ask you actually one question?
Yes, go ahead.
Before I go to that one. Since you already invited my colleague to teach with you, since she said that we interpret ideas rather than words, are you going to invite me to teach with you if I say this?
Let's see what you say.
And I want to hear your opinion on it. Namely, as you know, there are settings in which we are obliged to interpret verbatim. It means word by word.
Yes.
So how do you make the difference, and what is your opinion when we should interpret just ideas rather than just words, or when we have to interpret word by word? Where do you see the difference, and how you overcome that, what I see, kind of different and confronting opinions?
For those of you who may not have heard the question, it is when we are interpreting ideas but not words, but what happens when we are in certain situations or venues where it is required that there is what it's often called in the United States is a verbatim interpretation. Meaning every word has to be there. And more than anything, this is something that you run into in the legal system, in the courts. This is stepping off topic for just a moment, but I'm happy to answer that question. The simple fact is that the venue and the requirements of the client are going to dictate the approach that you will use in that case. I've taught a number of courses with court interpreters, helping them learn how to do long consecutive for different kinds of situations, because everyone in today's interpreting world, frankly, if they want to be successful and have the opportunity to get more work, they need to be versatile. And you can't just say, I work in the courts, or I work in hospitals, or I am a conference interpreter. And so you have to learn to be adaptable to these diverse circumstances. And so in the courts, it has to be what the law demands. And interestingly enough, I will say this, interpreting ideas and using long consecutive with notes and following the logic of the speaker and using all the techniques that are used in traditional long consecutive with notes, in many cases in court, it just doesn't work. Similarly, it just doesn't work particularly in psychiatric evaluations and things of those nature. I mean, you just have to be aware of that fact, and you have to adapt how you're going to be interpreting to the given circumstance. Because my experience has been that very often in court what comes across from the witness stand doesn't make any sense anyway. And so if you're using long consecutive with notes where you're relying on internal arguments and logic in order to reproduce the speech, you're going to be hard-pressed to use that technique if there is no clear logic and contradictory ideas coming from the same speaker. So that's how I would respond to that. You have zeroed in on a clear distinction between venues or modes of interpreting, and it's something that takes a few years to master, and it's something that a lot of people grapple with. I would say, if you work a lot in court and you're hoping to branch out into other areas, realize that there are different approaches to interpreting, and you shouldn't think that I have to do the verbatim interpretation everywhere, because it isn't appropriate everywhere, just as long consecutive with notes is not appropriate in certain circumstances. So there you go. All right, so we're back to Matthew. We've had all of these things that you've been able to point out. How would you go about fixing them? All right? If he's speaking too fast, or if you find that you're in a situation where you're speaking too fast, how do you work on that? How do you improve that? Well, okay, we've got a hand here.
I don't know what sort of setting he was in, but if he could try and anticipate the setting or the subject matter, then maybe he would be more, he wouldn't be as surprised if they were talking about pigs in Romania.
Okay, so preparation.
Increase décalage, so first he gets an understanding of what is being said, and then he can construct a clearer and more fluent translation.
That makes sense. A couple other comments here.
Maybe sounds strange, but well, I usually write down slow, right on my notes on the top, and every time I just turn the page, because I know it's my problem, I look at the first page, just a reminder to myself.
I like that. Let me say one other comment over here. Get back to that.
This is actually very simple. Don't forget to breathe.
Yeah, don't forget to breathe. I did that once. It was horrible. I was working for a large organization that was doing a satellite broadcast to all of Latin America. It was in the Spanish booth. And I forgot to breathe. And I was about 45 seconds into my interpretation, and I realized I didn't have any air left. And I was starting to get lightheaded. And at that point, but I didn't want to hyperventilate, because if I did, it was going to go out to all of Latin America. And my booth mate had to take over. This is when I was really young. I was probably 23. And so it was almost like, hit the cough button. And so, por eso vemos que, in trying to catch up on that, you've got to remember to breathe. Now, let me go back to the comment we had over here about hitting down slow at the top of your notes. This gets at one of the things that I mentioned in those rules. Function should dictate form. Function's more important. What works for you? What's going to help you remember? Now, all of these things that we've mentioned, he needs to increase his décalage, very true, but again, you'll think, okay, how do I do that? And I often find that with décalage, when you teach that, what happens? People put the cart before the horse and they think, okay, it's a question of décalage. So therefore, if I extend my décalage by 3 seconds, I will be better. Which isn't the case, because décalage, I've found, actually adjusts appropriately whenever all the other elements are in order. And that way, it's not a question of thinking by adjusting décalage you improve, but by improving your interpreting and understanding how to approach a speaker, your décalage will adjust as it should. What I would point to you is that you have to practice. That's the real thing here. If he's fast like this, all right, then go back. If you can get a recording of what that was, or you can remember what it was, go back and work on it. Ask yourself, one thing that I'm going to work on during my practice session. If I were to take all of the very correct feedback that I received from all of you, and I were to dump that on one interpreter at one time, you start chasing after ducks, and you're going all over the place. So I got to work on my décalage, I've got to slow down, I have to remember to breathe in the right places, I have to slow down, and I can't chase after words. Let me try and interpret again. And then they're just scattered. When you interpret and you're practicing, work on one thing and one thing only. And if you achieve that one thing, even though everything else maybe wasn't as good as you would like, you've been successful. That's enough. Work on that one thing for that session. If it's slowing down and sounding understandable, that's your goal. If you miss details, if you didn't get all of the information included, that wasn't your goal. Focus on the one thing that you want to work on for that practice session. You really have to simplify it, because there's so much that goes into a good interpretation. If you try to get it and have that wonderful example, okay, what's my goal? I'm going to have this perfect, flawless interpretation that everyone's going to love. It's not measurable, it's not really actionable, and you're not going to get there. Okay? So one thing. Let's go ahead and listen to Matthew as he goes through this a second time. And I will tell you that this is a recording that I use when I'm introducing simultaneous interpretation to people who have not been trained before. And we discuss this, and we look at it and say, well, what was wrong with it? I don't know that any of you actually pointed out that it just made absolutely no sense, which is probably the biggest problem there. And now we're going to have Matthew go through this, just focusing on the ideas and communicating the ideas that he understands.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not a farmer. I'm not an expert. But today, I'd like to talk about pigs. Pigs in Romania. In the last few years, there's been a lot of investment in large pig farms in Romania.
That's right. And I'll have to share with Matthew the next time I see him that he was on display for a large group of professional interpreters in Toronto. I'm sure he'll get a kick out of it. Clearly, he was able to focus on the ideas that he had and delivered them in a way that we could clearly understand. The reason I shared this video with you is I want you to look at it and then think about your own practice. What are the things that you could be working on to improve your simultaneous or your consecutive? Write down a list. Get it down on paper, in your iPad, in your phone, wherever you keep goals. Because if you don't have it written down, as the adage goes, and I know this is a little, it's worn, but if it's not written down, it's not a goal. And if it's not written down, it's not going to happen. Find those things that will help you improve, one at a time. Because in spite of the fact that, well, all of us are here, and we can tell ourselves, I'm very professional, and I know all of these things, and I'm very capable of disconnecting myself from my own professional practice and observing and having myself do well. My experience has been that we're all human. And when push comes to shove, sometimes it's really hard for us to separate what we are from what we do, or who we are from what we do. And it takes a little bit of extra effort. So, just in review, as we wrap up. That's not Separate who you are from what you do. Don't fall in the same hole twice. And I will say that I do this still regularly, perhaps not with my interpreting, but as I try to get ready to prepare for speeches and whatnot, I always find myself not having enough time and wishing I had more time, and what can I do? We all have to work on it. Be specific. Feedback has to be measurable and actionable. If you work with agencies and with other large institutional clients, it can be very difficult to get feedback. Because once the job's done, they want to get it through the meat grinder, finish up, push it on, give people their checks, make sure the client's happy, move on, we've got another job to do. That's why you need to find ways to get it in just small amounts, and you make it very easy for the person who's going to give you feedback to do so. Having the kind of relationship, if you're able to do team interpreting, in your different settings. Having a strong enough professional relationship with your colleague is a wonderful opportunity. But you have to put it out on the table and say, look, if you have any suggestions for me, I will be happy to hear them. I want to improve as an interpreter, and I know that you'll be able to help me if you notice something, if you are so inclined. Opening yourself up like that most often will lead to having the other person say, you know what, same thing for me. Please feel free to help me. You have to be a little judicious about it because sometimes it can be a little dicey. But I've always found that it's better to be open and professional and honest than to necessarily be closed and always trying to protect myself. Function is more important than form. I'm not going to give you prescriptive lists of you have to do this, that, or the other. Find what works for you and that's going to move you along the path to better professional proficiency. Know your limits, reach just above them. Get a little bit more. Focus on a new subject matter. Whatever it is to help you stretch. And make your practice mindful and reflective. If you can do that, you will find significant headway will be made. This is what I'm trying to do in my teaching so that I can be a better interpreter trainer. Because I can't just keep doing what everybody's done in the past. We have to find new ways to train people. Right now, how are we going to train people online? It's a big challenge. We've got someone here in the room who's doing a pretty amazing job. There are so many things that we can improve on as a profession. And if we want interpreting to be an important part of this century, then we have to make it recognized. It has to be high quality, high caliber, because people still don't understand what we do and what it takes to do what we do well. And we have to be our own ambassadors. So with that, I guess the only thing I would say is, let's see if I can move forward. Now that I've shared that with you, please be sure to pay it forward. Thank you very much. I guess there is some time for questions.
We still have 15 minutes for questions, so maybe if you can, whoever has a question can come to the podium so we
Actually,
can...
I can stay at the podium and just do this. Let's see if I can stay right here. I think I like to walk around when I speak because I've spent so much time in a box over the years.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much for the great presentation. I just wonder, by any chance, could you please share with us some good tips on to improve on the simultaneous interpreting? Can you give us some advice?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. I will go back to what I've said before because I can't really overstate its importance. If you want to improve your simultaneous interpretation, you have got to record yourself. You've got to listen to your own performance and become familiar with your strong points and your weak points. Because by its very nature, it's fleeting. And when we interpret, we are juggling so many things. We are multitasking, and our attention is focusing on, depending on which academic you read, on anywhere from, I think, 3 to 6 different processes at the same time, or rather, based on the new research that's been done, we're task switching very quickly between all of those tasks. We actually can't focus on 2 things at once. And so when you're in the booth or when you're being asked to do simultaneous chuchotage or whatever it may be, you're listening to the speaker, you're monitoring what it is you're saying, you're producing speech, you're processing ideas, and there are things that you're going to miss and just never notice. It's one of the reasons why interpreters can make mistakes and not remember them at all and think they've done a great job. So in terms of having some kind of tip to improve, only when you're going to do simultaneous interpretation, there isn't a lot that you can do in that very moment to improve. It has to happen outside of when you're being paid to do your job. And so setting aside time to do that, I would suggest you take, if you can carve out in your schedule, as busy professionals, I know it's hard, but if you can find an hour twice a week, I usually ask my students to spend 2 hours practicing for every hour in class. So if they have, in the case of a 3-language student, they have 3 simultaneous classes, that's 6 hours in class a week. They need to be practicing simultaneous interpretation 12 hours a week, you know, for them. But that's their only goal. That's the only thing they're focusing on. All the translation and other things, but they're not out working professionally. So an hour, 2 or 3 times a week, or finding a time where you can take a 2-hour chunk. And you've got to sit down and you can find a speech that is appropriate for the kinds of work that you do. Or perhaps you need to recreate that. If you have colleagues that you are comfortable working with and saying, let's get together and let's work to improve in a certain area, you know, you can get together, schedule 2 hours. And if it's some kind of interaction, if it's in the medical field, you know, you have to recreate the scenario so that you can then practice it and see where it is that you're struggling. And then you record yourself and you go back and listen. This is a labor-intensive process, but if you really want to improve, that's how it happens. What basically happened with many of the interpreters in the 20th century that started working is they were bilingual, they fell into it, and they learned on the job. They made mistakes along the way, and they were able to somehow get through it to reach a level of proficiency, and they just learned by dint of effort and volume. But you can shorten that process significantly, and you don't have to subject your clients to it, which is what is most important, by taking the time to do that practice. So, long answer, but shortly I would say you've got to find time every week. Start by recording yourself, and maybe it's just for 15 minutes, and going back and with a very critical ear, listening to yourself, and identifying, just like we did with the video here, what the problems are. And then taking it to the next step and asking yourself, why was I doing that? And be very honest with yourself. Because that's when the external factors come in and we start to say, oh, the doctor just has a really thick accent. Or, no, that patient just spoke really quickly. And you can explain all of the possibilities for growth away by saying that it's not my problem. But turn it in on yourself, and then look at it, and once you've been able to assess what those are, pick one and work on it. And once you're comfortable with that one, move on to the next and work on it.
Notice that in simultaneous interpretation, your client has a lot of feedback, especially if he knows some of the language that is being interpreted. And sometimes I just could keep quiet because I know he got it. And he sees that flows better. Because there's no need to interpret something that he already is answering some way. But the feedback of your client is very important, not just in the moment you're doing it, especially when it's in the basis of 4 people in the room. You know, I can see it when he's in the conference setting. But to keep an eye in your client is, for me, has been very helpful.
Oh, definitely. The best feedback I get in a room when simultaneous interpretation is being used, when you are working in a simultaneous setting, the first 15 minutes, and actually the deck is stacked against the interpreter at events at the beginning, because the first day, or even the first 30 minutes, because often interpretive events are only a day long now, your audience is coming in, and they're going to decide within the first 5 minutes if they're going to listen to you or not. And so that's compounded by the fact that you're cold, you're just getting started, you're probably a little nervous, the speakers are nervous because everybody's worked really hard to get to this event where they are, and they usually start out by reading people's bios, which is one of the worst things that an interpreter can be asked to interpret. And so the best feedback I get is I see the headphones stay on. Or you've got bilingual people in the room that know a little bit of the language that's being spoken, and they're thinking, maybe I can get by. But after they listen to you for a little bit, they slide the headphone on both ears and they kick back and they start listening. That's some of the best feedback I think interpreters can get. So you're right. Let me just mention here is another thing that you can do. If you find yourself working in meetings where you end up having to interpret these bios, now it is nice to have them and sometimes you'll have them written, but even then they can be difficult. One of the things that I focus on with my students is specifically bios. We'll have a module where we will take one, maybe 2 classes, and we're going to focus on nothing but bios. And I'll get bio and another bio, and they just have got to work with them and over again until they realize there's a pattern to them. And they realize that there are approaches that they can use to avoid having problems and sounding like Matthew did on the first rendition of hearing something like Harvard worked as a professor. You finally get something. He worked as a professor at Harvard. He has an honorary degree from such and such university. And you can work through those specifically. Again, it goes to identifying where the problems are and then working on them and fixing one thing at a time.
Are there any different strategies or tactics to follow or to look for when interpreting simultaneously in a conference interpreting versus court and healthcare?
Specific between court and working simultaneous in a conference setting, no, there aren't any in the book. When you're talking about strategies, the main difference is that when you're working in a conference setting, it truly is going to be idea-based more than focusing on producing each and every word or stutter or hesitation or finding an equivalent of the salty language that someone may be using in the courtroom. Just your approaches are going to be very different based on what the goal of the interpretation is. So, but within the book, no, there aren't any specific strategies.
Yes, could you please spell decollage, because we seem to have a little bit of difference of opinion here.
I thought I heard you say spell decollage.
Yes, I did.
Oh, I think I would turn to one of my French-speaking colleagues, and I think it has some accents on it. I usually refer to it as lag, L-A-G.
Yeah, it's D-E-C-A-L-A-G-E, décalage.
If you were to put décalage and then put something like Lederer or just certain names, Gilles, I'm sure it'll come. It's probably just fairly buried down because it's probably not anywhere as known as the term in art.
Thank you so much. That was actually an outstanding presentation from Barry.